Welcome, everyone. My name is Hallie. I'm a member of the Quad Education team, and I want to thank you all for joining us for a webinar, this webinar on finding your unique voice and story as it pertains to your college application. We have two fantastic Quad Education consultants here with us today who are going to walk us through this topic. I know as college applications are approaching, this is at the forefront of everyone's minds. So hopefully, I know that we will get some great info from our panelists, and you'll also be able to ask some questions at the end to help you along further. So for those of you that don't know, Quad Education is a college application consulting company, and we work with students and families through the entire college application process, from just beginning to build out your college profile, deciding on extracurriculars and classes in high school, all the way through actually deciding which school you're going to attend on decision day at the end of your senior year, and everything in between there. So with that, we'll just go over our agenda for today, and then I'll have our consultants introduce themselves. So we're going to talk about the importance of authenticity, how to craft your authentic voice. We'll talk about how to create a compelling narrative with that and showcase your vulnerability and individuality. And then we'll go over some expert tips and then open things up for a Q&A. So as you have questions during this, pop those into the Q&A box chat, and we will get to those at the end. Additionally, we are recording this webinar, and we'll send this out via email within a few days, so you can have all of this information at your fingertips when you need it later. All right, so we have Max and Nick here with us today. Max, can you introduce yourself for us?
Hello, everyone. My name is Max Schindler. I've been working with Quad for the past few seasons. In the past 5 years, I've helped kids get into every Ivy Plus school nationwide. And I went to Brown University, and I used to work in journalism, newspapers, and TV. And I bring that spice to the college essay and to the admissions process to grab the attention of the admissions officer.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here, Max. I know that your energy is going to set us off in a fantastic direction. Nick, can you introduce yourself for us?
Yeah, it's hard to beat that. That was awesome. So anyway, my name is Dr. Nick Acrocco. I live in beautiful Houston, Texas, which is 1,000 degrees right now. And I've worked with Quad for about 2 years. Worked with students from all over the country. I've been a director of college counseling at both a school in New Jersey and a school in Cincinnati, Ohio. I also have worked at St. John's School right here in Texas, which is a pretty elite kind of place, but worked in admissions at both Vanderbilt University and University of Pennsylvania. So helped lots of students go to a lot of different places. I also teach adults college counseling at Rice University, 2 miles up the road from me online, which I did before the pandemic. So anyway, all that to say, like, been through this process lots of times. I was stressed out as you can imagine, like I think many families are. But all to say, like, what we're here for at Quad is like to help you figure out what the process is and what the process isn't. And I think Max would agree. We get questions all the time that begin, I heard that, my friend said, my neighbor said, my cousin said, I read online. So those are things that we can absolutely help with. And so anyway, all that to say, great to be talking to you all night, and hope we can give you some wisdom.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for being here.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start off and talk about the importance of authenticity and how it pertains to your college application. Dr. Nick, you want to start us off here?
Yeah, so one thing I would say is, like, I've often told students this, the nicest word I can write on your application in my comments is genuine. And I think sometimes, like, and I'll be totally honest, like, I think sometimes parents are kind of like in the eaves, like kind of telling them what to say. It's not one thing that they're looking for you to say. You want to just be genuine. That sounds really obvious, and that can also be really hard. But basically what you're going for is, like, instead of saying, like, hey, I showed leadership, or I was a mentor, how did you show that? The more details you can give, the better. So that's the thing. You'll hear a million times when we do our essay coaching, show, don't tell. So it's not about saying like, hey, I did this. I was a leader. I was a mentor. I was compassionate. How are you those things? Like give the evidence for it. That's what's going to be really compelling to committee.
To build on Nick's point of being genuine, again, we don't know what time of night or day the admissions officer is reading your essay, after how many kids. We don't know their race, their religion, their gender, their politics. So in terms of trying to keep their attention, it's safe to assume, I think they have a pretty strong BS detector, that they've waded through God knows how many essays that, as Nick was saying, don't show but tell. Say, I'm a leader, without going into the detail of all the hours and all the late nights that you pulled and everything you've done. So I think in terms of being genuine, it's about keeping your voice, you as a 17-year-old. And it's almost like wearing business casual clothing. Like, no, you're not using the same degree of slang as you would with your friends, but it's as if you're raising your hand in class and talking to your teacher. So it needs to sound like you and your genuine voice. And I think the tips that we're going to give you tonight could nudge you in that direction. And what Nick said, show, don't tell, that lies at the heart of writing a good personal statement.
And there's one thing else I'd add to this. Like, I think Max would agree with this. We both have worked at really highly selective universities. And I stole this line from one of my colleagues. So it's like, you got the great test scores, you got the great curriculum, you got all that, you got the great grades. So that gets you a seat at the table. So whether you're applying to Vanderbilt or Penn or Brown or any of these places for that matter, that's what they've got. So when it comes to that part where you talk about the subjective data, the essays, letters of recommendation, interviews, all that good stuff, that's where it makes the difference. One of my favorite statistics, and this is a little bit horrifying, but Dartmouth denies 3/4 of perfect SAT scores. That's how many they get. So this is what we're talking about tonight, is like how to make that voice. You have to see at the table. So how do you make them say, oh my goodness, we really like the student because. So, and that's the thing. It's not necessarily what you want to do. Like, there's not one activity. There's not one thing that you have to do. But what we're trying to say tonight is like, here's how to make that stuff like really pop.
And grab the attention of the admissions officer. Exactly.
So I'm hearing, it sounds like from what you're both saying, it's you have like an outline of a person, the test scores kind of build that, your grades kind of build that, but it's your personality and who you are that fills it in and gives it dimension and, feeling, and like someone that you want to get to know. And that's kind of a big piece of what matters here. Is that,
as you said, someone you want to get to know? And at least for my kids and my track record, I almost ask my kids to push the envelope slightly to get the attention of the admissions officer, because as to build on Nick's point, it's not enough perfect SATs. It's not enough being Eagle Scout. It's not enough. You need something that's going to amaze the admissions officer. And we're going to talk about it later. It doesn't have to be a tragic event. It doesn't have to be something groundbreaking. It can be something very regular, mundane, like playing basketball, but the way you flesh it out and the way you showcase your intellectualism and your authenticity, that could hook the reader. Where was I going with this? Okay, back to you guys.
No, the only thing I would add is, can a counselor get an amen? Like, exactly. Like that totally on point.
And at least, and I don't know, Nick, if you do this, what I do is I ask kids to push the envelope, take a risk, and then we get a second, third, fourth opinion, someone maybe who's more socially conservative, to see if we can get away with the hook and get away with something a bit more bombastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so I'm a stand-up comedy fan. So oftentimes with students, I say, go there, say it, do it, push it. Like was it? And also, like, there was one time I had a student who I tremendously liked. And he and I just like we got each other. We had a good rapport. We were doing all that. And his essay was a little bit, and so I said, okay, I'm gonna ask my colleague if she likes this, we submit it. If she doesn't like it, we can't, because I get you this much. She loved it. So anyway, he submitted that. He was successful. So all that to say, like, it's not one particular thing, But what I think happens sometimes is students, and like, there's a lot of questions I get there, like, is my GPA quote good enough? Is my test score good enough? And I would say, like, higher is always better, but there's other factors that they're looking at. And so that's what we're going for. It's not like, I really want to go to, Brown or Dartmouth or Vanderbilt or Penn or Rice or any of these places, and I've got a 1520. Is that good enough? There's a lot of other factors at work here. And that's one thing that we can help at Quad is, like, we try to figure out, like, okay, who are you? What is your story? What's going on? That's what we're trying to communicate.
Awesome. I love all of this. And let's talk a little bit more about how to actually craft that authentic voice. We know we need it. How do you execute?
Absolutely. So in terms of crafting your authentic voice, quite often when I'm working with kids, I'll ask them, and I'll ask you, pour it out onto the page. Let the process itself be therapeutic. No, this is not, I don't want the end result to be look like therapy, but I want you getting everything down so that we can then mold that material and shape that material. And we have some tips in terms of how we can help you channel your authentic voice and get it down on the page.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, one resource. Well, there's actually two resources I use all the time. So even if you're not applying to these places necessarily, these are great resources, because I remember I always try to put myself back in, like, the shoes of being, like, 16 and applying to college and trying to figure out what that looks like. College essay is like nothing a student has ever necessarily, like, read or written before. So there's two resources that they often cite. Even if you're not applying these places, it's totally okay. You got Connecticut College, which, as their name strongly implies, is in Connecticut. And there's Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. If you Google essays that worked, not only do they show you examples of great essays, some are funny, some are sad, some are triumphant, but it also gives you admissions officer comments at the end. So if you're like, I'm not applying those places, why am I looking at them? This is what they're going for, because I'll tell you, like, what Hopkins is looking at, what Connecticut College is looking at, pretty much any selected place that you're looking at, that's what they're kind of going for. So it just gives students, like, an idea. This is kind of what works. So these are all students who have been admitted, and they also give you admissions officer comments at the end.
Yes. So to build on Nick, those are two good free resources. Free. Okay. Correct. You're already spending a lot of money on the college admissions process, so right. Good. I think you're on mute.
Ooh, sorry about that. I am on mute.
Okay.
Thanks. I'll also say that we do have a free webinar coming up. I think it's next week or the week after on brainstorming for your personal statement. And we'll go through different brainstorming exercises that a lot of our consultants will use that really are aimed at getting to the heart of who you are in kind of fun and creative ways that aren't, why do you want to go to this college? Should you go to this college? What do you want to be when you grow up? But, like, getting into who your personality, which will help you craft that authentic voice as well. All right, so here we're going to dive into some specifics.
So what I would say is, like, sometimes, like, the essay takes on this kind of, like, mystical, like, realm in the admissions ether, as I often say. But you want to reflect on, like, who are you and what do you want to say? So, like, we often talk about, like, if you're funny, be funny. If you're not funny, this is not the time for your comedic debut. If something was really awesome, let's talk about that. I had a student I worked with a couple of days ago, and she had lost her dad, and, like, the entire essay was kind of about, like, I lost my dad. And I'm like, okay, but what's the reflection from it? So, like what's the takeaway from that? What was the lesson from that? So that's the thing, is, like, it can be really difficult, but again, looking at these examples might give you a really good idea. So, like, this is what they're going for.
To build on Nick's point, so what? And I think that's a question, so what, you can ask of anything. So something tragic happened in your life. You lost a parent. The question now, and I hate to sound callous, I'm a former journalist. The quote is, if it bleeds, it leads, on a front page. It's really, journalism can definitely objectify death to a terrible degree. But the question is, so what? How did you, what changed in your family and your responsibilities academically now? I mean, are you now asking questions of theology or philosophy? You have to tie it to a larger picture if you're going to do a tragedy, if you're going to do something that happened in your family. And just building on Nick's point, to me, and I push my kids, you can have that reflection about something terrible happening in your life, but it needs to be a larger picture, who you are today, what you're going to study intellectually, what you're going to contribute.
Yeah, there's a technique I got from a New York City colleague, and I think about this all the time. When you read the essay, and sometimes you go, okay, here's what I get from this. And you go, so the student the other day was like, I'm really sad my dad's gone. And I'm like, that's horrible. That's a terrible thing. That's a terrible thing. But what's the takeaway? What's the lesson from that? That's what we're going for. So yeah, that's one thing that I think, and that can be hard. I mean, that's hard for me right now as an adult. I think that might be really hard if you're if you're a teenager in high school.
Yeah, it's hard, and sometimes this college admissions process, it's the stress of it can be terrible. It really can. And I think recognizing that and trying to break it up step by step and really pouring onto the page your emotions, your feelings, your conclusions, and we'll talk about this later, being as vulnerable as possible. It's a way to try to make this very scary, overwhelming process more manageable.
Right. And if you're looking at our slide right now too, there's not one thing that they're looking for. So if you even look at consider your participation in clubs, sports, volunteer work, or other activities. Would you learn from those? Why do you do that? So I'll give you a great example. We get a lot of students who will say, many universities will ask a question like, what do you want to study and why? So we'll have a lot of students who will say, I want to do math because I like solving problems. Right. That's kind of what math is. But what about math gets you excited? Tell us more about it. What's the thing? So, and again, it's one of those things that I think Max and I have had students where it's I love whatever topic. Well, what do you love about it? What do you want to do? What's the next part? That's what they're going for.
It's about, to build on Nick's point, it's about showing evidence. You can't just say, I love math. And there's another quote in journalism that before this session, when the three of us were chatting, I mentioned, it's, if your mother says she loves you, verify it. What does that mean? Don't just tell me your mom loves you. Show me that she makes PB&J sandwiches for you every morning, drives you around to lacrosse practice, tutors you in math, and tucks you in bed at night. That is showing love. So the other theme throughout this, show not tell, and show the evidence.
Right.
And I think that ties all back to also, I love math, because you can then say the exact math theorems that inspire you, the exact types of math, if you've taken any summer courses, if you had an amazing teacher that blew you away. There are ways you have to show the evidence for why and how you love math. You can't just say, I love math. You got to prove to the reader why that's the case.
Exactly. And here's the last thing I want to say. Look, I'm a history guy. I can barely do arithmetic, okay? But I want to hear from a math student, the Fibonacci sequence just blows my mind. And here's why. That's what we're going for. Even if they don't understand it, I had a student in one of my homerooms at one of the high schools I worked at. He wrote some research paper, and I said, okay, here's the title of his research paper. So I just put it in my letter of recommendation. And I said, I have no idea what that means either, but it's pretty impressive. Wouldn't you agree? So that's the thing. Is they don't have to understand what you're saying, but all that to say, tell them details. It's not just, here's a proclamation. You've got to show them what the evidence is.
Values. Exploring your values. So for me, when I'm getting my kids to brainstorm to write the personal statement, I do ask them. I want them to reflect on key moments. I want them to go into detail about their family and upbringing and go into the controversies behind that, the politics. If you're from a more liberal family, if you're from a more conservative family, if you've wrestled with your parents' ideology, if you question what your parents have taught you, make it come alive. Make there be a debate. Make there be a conflict or a controversy, or don't just exactly flesh it out. Or if you agree 100% with your parents' philosophy, show why and how. And of course, on this call, we all agree with all of our parents, okay? You guys can do no wrong. But that is, especially when it comes to family and upbringing, I really push my kids for the meat there. Passions and interests, of course, going into detail about that helps. And I always, if a kid comes to me and says, I don't know what I like, I say, that's okay. You don't need to know what you're passionate about. But through doing and trying this club or volunteering here, maybe through action in the world, you'll develop a passion. And you'll develop, maybe this is what I want to major in. You don't have to have all the answers today. When we were 16 or 17, I didn't know anything back then. I had no idea what I wanted to do. That's the third point. And then the fourth point, and then I'll hand it over to you, Nick, personal struggles and challenges. This can be more difficult, and quite often I really ask my kids and I tell them this process is confidential. I'm not repeating this information. Write down what you're comfortable with. We don't have to share it with your parents necessarily. Let's just get it on the page and see what psychological material we have that we can channel it into a narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the thing is, like, there's lots of paths to victory. So there's not like one thing you have to do. There's not like, okay, it's not like committees going, all right, let's think about like, what's your struggle? Like, so I remember like I actually like put these like clips together. So I used to show it to my students. So in Modern Family, there's a famous episode where the older daughter is applying and she's a little bit of an airhead. That's kind of part of the joke. And she's like, I don't have an obstacle to overcome. And so her mom then like takes her outside and they go for this drive. And then she leaves her outside without her phone or keys. And then she's like, now you have an obstacle to overcome. So, but it's not one thing that you have to do. So it's not like every student is, struggling or, it's not like a tearjerker. And again, it might sound like we're talking out of like both sides of our mouth, but like be you, be genuine. One of my favorite pieces of advice, I got this from one of my colleagues who worked at Tufts University. She's like, okay, if I read 100 college essays, could I pull out one and show it to your best friend and say, is this what your best friend wrote? That's kind of a good, kind of idea for it. But it's not one thing that they're looking for. They want to hear you be authentic. They want to hear genuineness.
Awesome. All right. So we just touched on this briefly, but how do you figure out what you like?
So here's the thing. I think there's tremendous pressure. And I remember this, again, I always try to like put myself back, in high school. There's tremendous pressure for like high schoolers where it's like, okay, when an adult sees you, they say, okay, hey, where do you go to high school? And you say, I go to this high school. And they go, oh, well, where do you want to go to college? What do you want to do? Like you don't have to know exactly what's going on. So in terms of like thinking about what you want to do, like a question I've started to ask is instead of saying, hey, what do you want to major in, is what problems do you want to solve? So, Max has talked about this too. Like, it doesn't matter politically what you think. It doesn't matter where you're kind of coming from. But if you look at the world, I think all of us can say, this is something I would change about the world. So what is it? How do you want to fix that? So like, the student I had the other day with computer science, I was like, but what about computer science gets you excited? Like, what do you want to do? Like what's the next step? Like, aside from, it's really interesting. But what's interesting about it? Like, so anyway, that's the thing. They're not necessarily looking for like one thing you've got figured out. I often say deans of admission want curiosity, not certainty. They like it when you're not sure. They like it when you're like, the world is new. And I'm sure, Max would agree with this. Like when we would often think about committee, we'd go, okay, this student from this background, we want to talk to this other student from this totally different background and find each other unusual and learn from each other. That's kind of what college is all about. So it's okay if you're sitting there as a student right now going, I don't know what I want to major in, I don't know where I want to go. That's fine. That's totally okay. That's what college is all about, is figuring that out.
To build, Nick, on your point, I love your question, what problems would you fix? It's really pushing to flesh out the major. And I think it's more than just saying, I want to study business because I want a decent paying job. And I get the cost of college is exorbitant. You might be taking out loans, and it's okay to want a reasonable return on investment from a degree. I understand that. But when coming into college and trying to persuade the admissions officer that you belong, you need something a bit more grounded and philosophical and impactful than I simply want to make a decent paying job. And it's, again, okay that you don't know what your passion is today. I think if you try, especially if you're an underclassman in high school, you can try a bunch of different clubs, sports activities. In college, you'll have that opportunity. It's a question of going you don't have to have a love affair with your major, but you do need to be somewhat interested in that field and in that direction.
Absolutely. And this goes for lots of schools. So I worked at Penn, so I get a lot of students who want to go to Penn. And so there's a question that basically says, why do you want to go to Penn? And Brown has it, and NYU has it, and Rice has it, and Vanderbilt has it. So they have all these questions. And so when I work with my Penn students who are applying, there's a lot of, well, I want to go to Penn because Wharton's the best business school. And again, this could be any place. Like, this could be any selected place. And I often joke with them. I go, do you really think they're sitting up there in Philadelphia going, golly, we got this great business school, but no one knows about it. But this one student said, I want to go there because it's a great business school. Why do you want to go?
You got to show the evidence that there's something in business you want to transform, some type of startup, some type of maybe renewable energy. God knows, flesh it out some reason, how you're going to change business, what you want to do if you're in an entrepreneurial club in high school. But building on Nick's point, yeah, you got to show the evidence.
Right. And the thing is, like, even if these schools are not on your list, when they ask us why us, they don't want you to, like, I often tell students, don't gush over them. Well, it's really good. It's ranked high. It's in the Ivy League. No. Why do you want to do what they're asking? So one thing I ask sometimes to students, I go, they are asking, if we gave you this opportunity, what would you do with it? Aside from, exactly. You're a great school.
And part of that is mentioning a specific professor whose research blows you away. Absolutely. Or a course that you would kill to sit in, so that the admissions officer can literally visualize you in the seminar room. And that's a good essay, when you can make it that vivid and that detailed.
All right. Real quick story before we go to the next slide. So one of my absolute students who I just I remember I worked with them 4 or 5 years ago. So sent him to Vanderbilt, my alma mater. And I don't know if you guys know about this, but John Meacham, he's a presidential historian. And there was a documentary with John Meacham. And I'm watching the John Meacham documentary, and I see my student in the documentary. So I got on my phone and I started texting, was that you in the documentary? And he's like, yeah. And so I had serious envy about that. But all that to say, I want to go there because I think John Meacham's cool. I think his courses are cool. That's what they're going for. The more proper nouns you can use, the better off you're going to be.
Yes. Amen. Amen.
Fantastic. And I also want to add here, I know a lot of people will be asked, what do you want to major in? Like Dr. Nick mentions, and, think about what problems you want to solve. But you also want to make sure you keep your mind open. There's a million different topics that you don't even know exist, that college is there for you to explore and dive into. Sometimes it's really interesting to think about the things that you don't know and what problems don't you know exist yet, or how can you break into new areas that are kind of undiscovered in your background so far. And You can dive into those and learn a ton of new things. And if you say, I've decided I want to do computer science and I will only do that, you lose a whole bunch of other context and information. So even if you know what you want to do and you go into college, make sure you take classes that aren't in your major and you go for something that
Absolutely.
you've never heard of before.
Absolutely.
And you might find some passions there.
Right.
All right. Vulnerability.
Vulnerability. This lies at the heart of what I tell my kids to do. And quite often it's really difficult because, as Nick said a couple minutes ago, writing the personal statement's unlike writing anything else in your life. And if you're a normal, regular high school kid, I don't know about you, quite often you're writing an English essay, maybe it's the night before, and you're just cramming in detail. And I used to teach English in high school, so I know it breaks my heart to describe it this way, but such is life. You're trying to cram in detail to fill out the page and click send. And your teacher is getting paid to read it. And I want you instead, the way I tell my kids, think of it, it's a New York Times article, okay? Or any journalism article. And the moment you get bored in it, guess what you can do? You can chuck it away. You can click X on the article. So how do you keep the reader's attention? Through vulnerability, through bearing your soul. And again, it's a balancing act because this is not a creative writing exercise. And if you're used to writing a 5-paragraph academic essay, this is a very different form of writing. And the way I analogize this writing to is much more journalistic. But by being journalistic, there's a way in which you can be vulnerable and be open about your emotions and show physical actions. And rather than just tell the reader, hey, I'm sad, show that you sat on your stoop and bawled out your eyes all night long after you got your heart broken because your first love ghosted you. I don't know. I mean, also be careful about writing about romance. I would say that's somewhat taboo, but anyhow, I was giving you an example of physical imagery and vulnerability. But I really push my kids in this regard, and Nick, you can chime in, to at least in the drafting process, to be as open and vulnerable as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say a couple of things here. So one of the more cliched essay topics is what we call the I won the game kind of essay. So there's a lot of sports essays that are like, oh my God, 10 seconds left. And then I did this and I won. So one of the things, and this is a hard concept for a lot of students to kind of embrace, but we're talking about embracing vulnerability here. How about when you lost? You learn so much more when you lost. How did you lose? What did you learn from? And again, I think sometimes students are a little bit wary of that. The other thing that comes up, as we talked about, show, don't tell, use the 5 senses, okay? So when I'm in the locker room, this is what it looks like. This is what it feels like. Here are the tunes I pump to get myself ready in the morning. My cup of coffee always has this flavor, like whatever it is, but paint a picture. So that's one thing that can really help with your essay. So as opposed to just saying I had mentorship, I had leadership. Like how did you do that? What happened? Give the reader a picture.
It's almost as if, with my kids and building on Nick's point, I want you expending so much psychic energy on writing this that you're exhausted afterwards. And you're showing so much detail about the tunes, the exact bands and artists, the songs that you play to pump yourself up and your exact routine, and you physically show the locker room. That is what's going to keep the reader's attention. Because the moment you bore the reader, God knows how many other essays they have to read that day.
Right.
And Dr. Nick is relocating temporarily.
Yes, I'm sorry. I have to plug in my
nothing to apologize for.
Okay, no problem. That's what's going on. So I was like, okay, my I was about to that. Sorry, folks.
All right. So how do we take all of that and craft a unified identity?
So often I advise kids that all the different aspects of your file should complement each other, personality-wise, interest-wise. So if you're going for bio, you maybe have a medical club extracurricular, maybe your essays going towards more of the intellectual, inquisitive nature, to make sure there's a common theme throughout your file. And I think that can really help in terms of a unified identity.
Yeah, I'll say, like, one of the comments I used to make as an officer was, what a beautifully organic file. Everything kind of echoes. Everything's kind of like, this happened, that happened. So that's kind of it. Now, one thing I will say, and again, at the risk of like talking on both sides of our mouth, but passion is used a lot. So with the students I work with, I'll see, it's my passion. It's my passion. I know we have in the slides here. You want to show them how that's your passion instead of saying it's my passion, because again, that's telling. So how is that your passion? So if it's like, I was doing the other day, computer science, robotics. Okay. So what about that gets you excited? As opposed to saying it's my passion. How is it your passion? What are you talking about?
I normally don't even let my kids use the word passion, because through showing physical action and the 5 senses that you mentioned, Nick, that demonstrates and is evidence for your passion. So don't tell me, the reader, about your experience. Don't tell me about your passion. You got to show.
Right. Exactly. I mean, like, I had a student the other day, and I always say this, like, I feel bad for students because I've been to admission sessions. So I visited 5 schools when I was doing my own college search. But as a college counselor, I've been to hundreds of schools and hundreds of admission sessions, and they would say, "What's your passion? What is it? What's that?" So I think students feel like the need to say it, but they also have to understand, and I think Max would probably agree with this. It comes up a lot in essays. So you go, okay, it's okay if you're passionate about something, sports, arts, like science, whatever it is. Don't say it's my passion. Show how it's your passion.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to a lot of kids. Your experience with writing essays is for English class. So quite often you're telling and not showing, and you're describing in general passion and experience and all these conceptual frameworks, when this is a different form. Again, I analogize it to, this is a beautiful news article, because you're just trying to hold on to the reader's attention.
Right.
All right.
Yeah, so exactly. I mean, I think what we're really saying is, like, well, in A's next slide, like, create a compelling narrative.
All right.
Show, don't tell.
Show, don't tell.
Biggest piece of advice we can give you.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about how to craft a narrative, and then we'll talk about individuality before we go on to some tips and tricks. And then we'll go into our Q&A. So if you have questions, pop those in the Q&A box, and we'll pack as many questions in as we can with the time that we have left.
Yeah. So one piece of advice I've given students before, and I think this can be helpful. If you think about the Common App essay, you have 650 words. So it's basically 1 page, single spaced. And there are some students who go, I hate writing. I don't like to write. So here's what you do. Get your phone and get out the dictation app, or you can put it on your laptop and just tell a story. Even if you go, I don't know, you can delete that later. But you can get a draft out pretty quickly. Because if you think about it, like, every one of these essays, if it's 1 page, it only takes about 3 minutes to read. So you can get a pretty good, even if it's a horrible draft, and again, you're going, as we say, filler. But nonetheless, you've got a draft done. And I'll tell you something else. Like, a lot of students I work with, like, some of them are just beautiful essay writers. Like, sometimes I get drafts and I go, I don't even want to touch this. This is beautiful. Other times it's like, okay, I have worked with this student for 9 drafts and it's just not going to happen. So we work on that too. But all that to say, even if a student will send us something and it's like, okay, I don't know what to do with this. This is the worst thing I've ever read. A lot of times we can go, hey, actually, this is pretty cool, and here's why.
So to build on Nick's point that sometimes you'll have to do 9 drafts, sometimes you and I don't even want to touch it because it's a masterpiece. It is variable, and I think often, as long as you're bringing some substance to the table, you and we stylistically can spice it up, restructure it, point it in the right direction. So it's usually not as bad as you might think it is. That's
Right.
A. If it were perfect, we'd be out of a job. That's number one. But more than that, I do want to caution. I think sometimes kids, if you don't have creative writing experience and like that's not what you do for fun, this is not a creative writing exercise. We don't need tons of detail about some setting that has nothing to do with you. This is a personal statement, and all the information there must be concrete and detailed about you, not about the rain, not about the room, not about the setting. So it's a balancing act, physical detail about your actions in the world. And I think through these steps, through being honest and genuine, through addressing a personal topic, a personal anecdote, you're able to avoid that creative writing trap that I've seen kids fall into.
Yeah, and one thing Max said, and I say this all the time to students, I go, like, I know you're like, as a high school student, like you're being evaluated all the time with your teachers, but I always say, I'm your coach. I'm not evaluating you. I'm not mad if you don't like your draft. I'm not upset by that at all. But I'll tell you how it's better. One thing I tell a lot of students, I say, I'd rather you hear it from me now than them later, and them being the admissions committee. So but at the same token, like you look at it and it's fine. So one thing we also do for those of you who are like seniors or applying to college, that's why you're all on this call. One thing we do is what's called final review. And final review is exactly what it sounds like. So we just go in and we look at the Common App and we just say, here's what's great, here's what can change. I would say the vast majority of the time, everything's fine, but we look at it one time. So I always say it's a dry run before you hit submit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk a little bit about showcasing your individuality, and we'll go through the next few slides a little bit faster, just to make sure we get to the Q&A questions.
Yeah, so here's the thing. Like we sort of been like hitting on this, but like anecdotes are really, really great to show what you're trying to tell them. Just like I'll give you an example. Like there's kind of let me give you like show versus tell. So show would be, or rather tell would be, every day after high school I teach, or let me put it this way. I really care about like helping students how to read, as opposed to every day after school, I spend 2 hours teaching little Billy how to read. And here's what we read. So that's giving an example. So all that to say, like one is just proclaiming, the other is explaining. So the more swords you can give, the better.
Absolutely.
The more you write down on the page, the better.
Yeah, you can always edit, pull things out later, get it all down. Right. All right, let's go over some tips and tricks, and then we will dive into Q&As. So some of this we've talked about, and some we haven't quite yet, and we'll go into a little bit deeper.
So we talked about authenticity. Researching the college, I asked my kids to word vomit onto the page. Do your homework. I want you knowing all the professors in the department, the different courses, reading the student newspaper. Please go through and get a feel for the lingo, for the culture, for the feel of the college, so that when you're writing your essay, you can take that and the admissions officer can feel your presence on the campus. That's not just something cliche and generic. That requires you doing hours, especially for very elite, difficult universities to get into, doing hours and hours of background research and homework.
And absolutely. I think let's just point out too that for your personal statement, it's not going to be college specific, but your secondary essays and supplementary essays, that's where you're asked, why do you want to go to this school? And that's where this research is crucial.
Yeah. So before this call, like one thing I point out to Max, because he worked at Brown. So Brown famously has an open curriculum, and I cannot tell you how many students I have who apply to Brown and they just go, open curriculum. I'm so excited about it. It's so great. It's so wonderful. So Brown kind of they sort of revised like the way they asked that question. They said, okay, when you're applying here, knowing we have an open curriculum, what would you like to do? We also, like before this call, we talked about Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech changed their question. Besides ranking and sports, why do you want to come to Georgia Tech? So, and here's the other thing too, is if you look at like in NYU, right? So that's a really crowded market. You got Hofstra, Adelphi, Barnard, Columbia, Fordham, like all these places. And we'll get a lot of students who are right. There's so much to do in New York. Right. What would you like to do in New York? No one at NYU is like, wow, I didn't realize this town was so boring. No, they want to know what do you want to do here? So that's the thing. So that's an important. Another example I'll give real quick is like, so there's a wonderful university right next to Penn called Drexel, and you can actually like put your hands on like both sides, and you can actually like touch them both. If you take out your Y pen and you take out Penn and you put in Drexel and it sounds the exact same, that's not good enough. And that could be a lot of places. So anyway, why do you want to go there? Show them that you know them.
It's like a love letter to the school.
Correct.
All right.
Yeah, so
Yes.
So one thing I'll say about like write naturally, I often tell students like write to grandma. It's formal but familiar. So you never say to your grandma like, "Hey, what's up?" You would not say that, but you also wouldn't say, "Grandmother, the other day when I went to this school, I was conversing with." No one says conversing.
Yeah.
There's sometimes when I read an essay and I go, teenagers don't say this. It just does not sound right.
It's a balancing act, and
Yeah.
when in doubt, I mean, I would look at a CNN article, look at a New York Times article, look at how they're written. I think they do a good job of avoiding such ostentatious language,
Right,
and making it so it's crisp and clean and direct and business casual is how I analogize it to.
I like that. That makes a lot. That's I'm going to steal that. That's a good line. That makes a lot of sense to me. So yeah, you don't want to be like, like texting them like you're on TikTok or something, but you also don't want it to sound like you're running for Senate. Like I always say, like it's kind of there's a healthy balance there.
Or actually, you want it to sound a little bit like a campaign speech, stump for Senate, but you don't want it to. I get your point. You're not. This is not an overly flowery creative writing exercise.
It doesn't need to be the Declaration of Independence.
Well, thank you.
So sometimes, so here's the thing. Just I had one the other day. We sometimes like one of the things I've noticed is like what we call the Miss America speech, and it's like I want to do this. I want to do that. Okay, like we work with not making it sound like that. You can have those sentiments, you can have those ideas, but you don't want it to sound like you're Miss America.
All right. So with that, I think we'll dive into our Q&A. We have a couple great questions here. So one person asked if there's a topic that's overdone or trite. Or is it, I think one of you mentioned earlier, how you talk about the topic and what it reveals about you?
I mean, I'm pretty sure I know what Max is going to say here, but I would say like no topic is quote unquote wrong, but the ones that come to mind are like, I tore my ACL. That comes up a lot. And then there's also when in community service is great, like whatever you want to do, that's awesome. But there's a lot of community service essays that are like, I felt that I was going to change them, but they changed me. There's a lot of that. So instead, tell us if you did community service. That's wonderful. What inspired you about that cause? What inspired you about that community? Like tell us about that. So those are ones that kind of come up a lot. But again, like I've seen topics that have been done 8 million times that have been actually done really well. Yeah. But yeah, those are the ones that kind of come to mind.
I think Nick and I are on the same page in this regard. You can do a tear ACL essay, but you have to show how that changed your worldview, and then maybe not doing soccer allowed you to do some engineering project that then now you want to spend your time doing. There has to be depth and substance to these topics. I mean, I had one kid who's at Duke on a full merit scholarship, and I worked with him, and he wrote an essay about basketball. And what specifically? It was all about how he felt he had to be perfect, get perfect grades, be an Eagle Scout, do a startup, and then one time he can be mediocre and not care was when he was dribbling a ball that he didn't even make his JV team. So to echo Nick from way in the beginning of this session, you can write about failure. You don't have to write about, scoring the touchdown. You can write about losing. You can write about mediocrity. It's a question of how you channel that, how you package that, how you embrace the vulnerability behind that to keep the admissions officer's attention. So to answer your question, Jenny, I don't think there is an overdone or trite topic. It's all a question of how you write about it.
I mean, real quick, one of my favorite essays ever was a student, and she worked at an Italian restaurant, and like all of us who have had like a summer job or anything. So she was working there, and Italian food tends to be pretty heavy. So she's carrying the tray out, and she hasn't really learned how to balance it and all the stuff. She goes to her first table and accidentally dumps the entire tray on the family. And she wrote about it, and it was hysterical. And committee loved it because all of us have been there. All of us have had some version of pouring the tray over. And it was the simplest, stupidest, dumbest thing on her first day of working. So yeah, but that was a hit. What else we got?
All right. So I think this is going off of what we were just talking about a couple of slides ago. We have someone who says they naturally write like they have a thesaurus. Are they at a disadvantage with their essay?
I would argue no, you do not have a disadvantage. That's beautiful. If the rest of your file can back that up and your teachers can testify to that in your letters of recommendation, and that's who you are, you're just well-read, you like English, go for that. Keep that voice. And maybe Nick will disagree with me, but I think if that's your eloquence already, I think the other parts of your file will back that up.
So here's what I'd say. So on one hand, there's an expression that I often use, don't use a $5 word when a 25-cent word will do. So there's that. I also had a student one time, and I remember his writing had words, and I'm sitting there going, I've got a master's degree, and I have to Google the stuff because I have no idea what he's talking about. And I kind of thought he was going for if I use fancy words, I'll like it. And then I read his counselor letter of recommendations. No, that's kind of how he talks. That's kind of him. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. so that happened. It's not a bad thing, and they don't want you to sound like you're in third grade, but they don't want you to sound like you're running for Senate. There's a kind of happy medium in between there.
Great. All right. So if anyone else has any more questions, we do have a couple minutes. Feel free to pop those in. Max and Nick, is there anything else, anything we didn't cover today that you think is essential to finding your personal story and narrative that we didn't cover? Anything that you want to highlight again?
So I'll say this, and I hope this gives comfort, because this process can be really stressful. So a lot of colleges do what are called counselor fly-ins, and basically they fly in college counselors, and then they take you around and show you how awesome the school is, and then you tell the students hey, you should go there. So I've been to a lot of these, and a lot of times it's like a cruise ship itinerary. It's we do this, and then we do this, we do this. So I went to Hamilton College in upstate New York, wonderful liberal arts college, and they said, okay, here's a list of things you can do. And they were go visit the town, go on a campus tour, go talk to your students, go to a class, that kind of thing. And they also said, you can be an admissions committee all day long. And I miss committee. I've been in committee for hours, but I remember we had to be silent. Occasionally we would talk, but for the most part it was no, you just don't do that. So at the end of it, the dean, she says, hey, any questions or observations that you had? And I just said, I just wish families could see how thoughtful you were. I really, and I thought I felt that way at the places I worked at, but I'm they really do try to understand the student where they're coming from. It's not as nitpicky as it sounds. I think it can often feel that way, but all that to say, like, they're pretty thoughtful. They really try to like understand this.
Great. Max, anything on your end?
Yes, rather than, and I appreciate Nick's anecdotes, I guess I will go back to the essay writing process and just emphasizing again and again the importance of showing and not telling, of providing evidence, of being vulnerable, of fleshing out physical detail, the five senses. And again, I appreciate your time tonight and you listening. And I can only imagine how stressful it is today. We went through this process 10, 20 years ago. God knows how many. No offense, Nick. But it's getting harder every year.
Yes.
I ask that please be good to yourself. This is a marathon, not a sprint. Continue doing physical exercise, seeing friends, trying to balance it all and break down the work bite-size, bit by bit. Please do not wait until the night before early decision deadline, early action deadline. Please get a handle on this and feel free to reach out to us if you want any additional professional support.
Yeah. And to go off of that, I appreciate you absolutely bringing that up. It's essential to have self-care. And if you need an extra set of eyes, you want to run all of this by, Max, Nick, or other counselors, you can schedule a consultation with us and we can talk about how we can help you throughout the rest of this process. And then we also have some more webinars coming up. They're all free. You can sign up on our website and keep an eye out. We do one every weekish or so. And you can also see ones that we've done in the past. And we will also send out a recording of this webinar so you can see that. We did have one more question just come in that we do get. It's definitely a popular question. So I'm going to pitch it to you guys. And then after that, we'll wrap it up for the night. So if someone chooses to go test optional, is there more of an emphasis put on their essay?
Yeah, so this question's come up a lot. And if we were having this same webinar about 6 years ago, pretty much everywhere that people are applying, the selected places are going to be asking for test scores. In the absence of testing, everything else becomes more important. So basically the question we get all the time is, does test optional really mean test optional? And the answer is yes. Then the next question is always, but does it really? And then the answer is yes. So anyway, here's the thing. If you've got a really high test score, so if you got a really high SAT or ACT, we're going to tell you, send that everywhere. If you've got a lower one, we're probably not going to say to send that. So here's the thing. Most of us are not at the really high end or at the really low end. So they're kind of in the middle. So what's a student to do? The advice I've always given is, and Max, you can chime in here too, but if your test score would traditionally make you competitive, then submit it. If it would traditionally not make you competitive, then perhaps don't. But to answer the question directly, yes, they will put more emphasis on your essay.
And I would check to see, to Bill and Nick's point, if you're falling within the 25th to 75th percentile, or if you're below. Again, if your score is competitive in the median range, submit it. If it's below that, I would then be a bit more thoughtful about submitting that score or not.
All right. Yeah. Well, awesome. Thank you both. I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. It was great to have you all here. Dr. Nick, Max, it was great to have you both walk through this topic. I had a lot of fun and learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did as well. Keep an eye out on the emails. We'll send out a link to this within the coming days. I hope everyone has a really great night and good luck with your essays. Good luck with your applications. We know you're going to do great.
Have a good night.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.